I think there's something that happens when you come from a Palestinian family or Palestinian descent.
Palestinians have never commanded great resources.
Israel can do whatever it likes without fear of retaliation.
And that was the first time that I met that kind of paradox between Zionism and Judaism.
America is a benefactor and a partner in Israeli war crime.
So I remember that, and I remember growing up with these feelings. We'll never get it back. The land is lost, but it's beautiful.
If you go back and you look at public media, as I have recently, I was looking at headlines from the New York Times from the 1940s. The whole issue of Israel-Palestine was very much up for debate in the United States. You had very powerful, well-known people, Albert Einstein, publishing, letters in the New York Times expressing grave doubts about the Zionist endeavor, about the movement to establish a Jewish state in Palestine.
But I would say since 1967, with this tremendous drastic increase in America's financial and military support for the state of Israel under Lyndon Johnson, there has been successively, every president has proven to be more pro-Israel than the previous president, especially since the 1980s with the Ronald Reagan administration.
I have personally followed and supported Israel's heroic struggle for survival ever since the founding of the State of Israel 34 years ago. The United States will oppose any proposal from any party and at any point in the negotiating process that threatens the security of Israel.
The U.S. has adamantly refused to allow any parties other than itself into the so-called peace process, which is such a bad name.
Pushing forward direct talks, in this case, on the peace process.
An essential role in the peace process.
To move the peace process forward.
Following the peace process.
I'm not going to say the peace process, because the peace process is a charade that has basically facilitated the ongoing colonization of the West Bank by Israel.
The International Court of Justice has already ruled that all of Israel's West Bank settlements are illegal. The settlers have used the outposts to seize even more Palestinian land than has already been taken.
If you can't do a settlement freeze, forget it. It's not going to work. How can there be an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians when Israel is gobbling up the territory that they're supposed to be negotiating over?
Now the efforts of all who have labored before us bring us to this moment. A moment when we dare to pledge what for so long seemed difficult even to imagine, between two peoples who have both known the bitterness of exile. Now both pledge.
After the 2000 summit with Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat and Bill Clinton, one of the American participants, Aaron David Miller, who was in charge of the peace process desk at the State Department, said, "We were Israel's lawyers." As early as the mid-1990s, American negotiators understood that they would not be able to persuade and did not want to pressure sufficiently Israel to do the sorts of things that would have been required in order for there to be any chance for the Oslo process to succeed.
I hope also to stop building in the settlement, because if they continue to build this settlement, never will be peace on this land.
So Obama came back to that. And even Hillary Clinton, who, as Secretary of State, was very forceful after the election that they wanted to do this.
Put yourself in their shoes. Look at the world through their eyes. It is not fair that a Palestinian child cannot grow up in a state of their own. living their entire lives with the presence of a foreign army that controls the movements, not just of those young people, but their parents, their grandparents, every single day.
President Obama has said that given the talks going in a constructive way, Israel should continue the moratorium on settlements. Do you believe that that will happen?
Well, that certainly is our hope.
And Prime Minister Netanyahu said, no, we're not doing it. And that was the end of the story. They didn't do it.
So there are sometimes disagreements, but not to the point where it can cause damage to this overwhelmingly generous financial aid to the state of Israel. I mean, what, 30 billion over 10 years? More than $3 billion a year and so on, which was signed by Obama administration. And it always gets more because Congress gives Israel more than what the budget calls for.
And yes, Trump, like his predecessors, appointed Zionist Jews to the key positions that deal with Israel and the Palestinians.
Donald Trump has nominated attorney David Friedman as his ambassador to Israel. Friedman's far-right position spurring outrage among left-leaning Jewish organizations. Friedman advocates relocating the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and is a supporter of building new settlements in the West Bank.
These are all people whose families have contributed to settlements, and in the case of David Friedman, quite radical settlements. No serious negotiation can be conducted by these people.
Today we reaffirm the unbreakable bond of friendship between Israel and the United States. A friendship built on our shared love of freedom.
Israel is a democracy, of course, only for Jews. It is not a democracy for all of the people it governs. The business about how we share ideals and how, all of that, that's nonsense. That has never been a criteria for the United States supporting anybody. That's why, how can the United States have this equally long-standing, even longer-standing relationship of alliance with Saudi Arabia, which is the furthest thing from a democracy you can imagine, right? That's never been the criterion. There were many factors that probably fed into the decision to recognize Israel early on. After all, sympathy for the victims of the Holocaust was certainly a factor, and that was one that was, relatively widely held.
After the destruction of European Jewry, what it meant to be a liberal was to have sympathy for Jews. Jews were victims of fascism. 6 million Jews died after 2,000 years of persecution in Europe. So yeah, of course, now we have to support Jews. And since we actually don't want hundreds of thousands of Jews coming to the United States after World War II, what a good idea to send them to Palestine.
So also another thing you don't realize is how many people are pro-Israel without being very obviously Zionist or very, they're not waving an Israeli flag around, but they're pro-Israel in the Judeo-Christian perspective of unity and harmony and the Jewish lands need to be protected, then Jewish people need to be protected.
By the way, today in Palestine, in Nablus, there is 3,000 Samarites who are originally Jews. Samarites is a Jewish sect who always refused to become Israelis and remained Palestinian. And today they are prosecuted in Nablus in the West Bank, just like the rest of Palestinians, Muslims and Christians. Telling you that yes, there has been Jews in Palestine, and those are called Palestinian Jews, and who have the full right, like Christian Palestinians, like Muslim Palestinians, to be part of Palestine.
לפיכך נתכנסנו, אנו חברי מועצת העם, נציגי היישוב העברי והתנועה הציונית ביום סיום המנדט הבריטי על ארץ ישראל.
The question is, why did the United States recognize Israel, and why did it do so quickly after Israel's declaration of independence? President Truman recognized Israel within 1 minute of Israel's declaration of independence.
I also antagonized a lot of people by recognizing the State of Israel as soon as it was formed. And it was my hope that they would have a homeland where they could operate. So when the time came for that, we set up the Israeli government in Palestine, moved some of the Arabs out, and they were not moved out and thrown out. They were compensated for the land that they had to give up.
I think you can attribute that primarily to lobbying. Basically, the Zionist movement made a judgment in 1942, as expressed in its Biltmore program, named for the Biltmore Hotel in New York, where the Zionist movement met, that the United States was an emerging world power and the British Empire was on the decline. So the consequential nation in the world, and the one that needed to be cultivated by the Zionist movement, was the United States, not Britain. The so-called lobby that now has emerged and that has developed and that supports Israel in a variety of different realms didn't exist at that time, at least in anything like the form that it does today.
While we may at times disagree, as friends sometimes will, the bonds between the United States and Israel are unbreakable.
I speak to you today as a lifelong supporter and true friend of Israel.
For America. And we need a president who will be a champion for Israel.
By our unyielding, and I mean it literally, unyielding commitment to the survival, security, and success of the Jewish state of Israel.
And I think the role of AIPAC has become quite overwhelming, and it's a subject over which the two parties agree. And this is the power of AIPAC. I mean, AIPAC really writes legislation on the Middle East. Whenever you see a resolution in Congress, we condemn what this Arab group has done, and we support Israel because it was facing violence somewhere. All this is prepared by AIPAC.
A lot of the policies of the United States in the war on terror, in the war on Iraq, currently in the Syrian conflict, they're all related to Israel in some way or the other. If the United States does not actually grapple with its involvement in the region, this won't change.
In 1996, under President Clinton, a major piece of legislation was passed called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. That was the legislation that introduced the crime of material support for terrorism. A major leader in the pro-Israel lobby bragged about having authored that part of that act. And it was going to be used as a means to prosecute supporters of Palestinian rights in the United States, and it was.
I mean, in America, if you and I want to do lobbying on behalf of the state of Tanzania, we have to register with the Justice Department. The Israeli lobby is the most powerful foreign policy lobby in this country, and it doesn't have to register.
AIPAC in particular doesn't want to do that because then that's going to raise for them the question of dual loyalty for American Jews, because AIPAC is mostly supported by Jews. So if AIPAC is an agent of the Israeli government, does that mean that American Jews who are Zionists are also agents of the Israeli government?
We've built personal relationships with policymakers through our political activism to bring new ideas and policies to our lawmakers that will deepen the U.S.-Israel alliance.
There's a former congressperson, his name is Paul Findley, who wrote a very good book called The Dare to Speak Out. And he spoke about his own experiences and the experiences of other members of Congress who face the same lot, which is if you become outspoken in criticizing Israel, they will bring the whole force of money and pressure on you. So it's not entirely about money, it's about the culture. I mean, AIPAC, an American two-party system, have created a culture where if you don't support Israel, you are seen as there's something wrong with you.
This is very important to note that in the US for many decades now, since the 1960s, to be progressive, you didn't have to be pro-Palestine, the opposite. It was considered anti-Semitic in this country because of the effectiveness of the Zionist narrative of turning a pro-Palestinian human rights position into an anti-Semitic or a racist position. So you could be a progressive and a Zionist, which in my book, it's a paradox. I mean, this is a contradiction in terms.
So that's how you get people like Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, that generation of Democrats. It's part of their political DNA. You support abortion rights and you support immigration rights and you support the Equal Rights Amendment and you support Israel.
We had this label in the United States for a long time called PEP. It's terrible. It was progressive except on Palestine. So in the feminist movement, in the queer movement, in the labor movement, in the environmentalist movement, the civil rights movement, you had people who were progressive, but they were actually supportive of Zionists, or they would not take a position against Zionists.
And the most effective, sinister weapon that AIPAC has brandished is the conflation of anti-Semitism with support for Israel. That if you are critical of Israel, it means you're anti-Semitic. Well, in reality, it's totally different situation.
For me, Judaism and Zionism are completely separate. I'm a Jew, and I look at the softer, nicer part of Judaism that are dedicated to tikkun olam, or repairing of the world, which is social justice. For me, Zionism is a shame to Judaism because it is a colonial ideology that is based on European supremacy.
In Congress, it is extremely effective. If you're running for office in this country, for mayor of a small town, for sheriff, or even for a House seat, and so on, if you are branded as anti-Israel, it is as if they're saying you're a child murderer. So this is what AIPAC has succeeded in doing over the years. It created a culture of support for Israel beyond the two parties.
Even on a college campus, there's pro-Israeli Zionist groups all the time that are going to monitor you and they're going to speak out against you. My sister is actually very active. She's a very strong voice. She used to go to IUPUI in Indianapolis, did a lot of work for Palestine, repeatedly had, again, some of these Zionist groups would send out notices to her professors or to administrators saying that this person's anti-Semitic, she's against Israel, she hates Jews. Another, one of her friends, same campus, they sent out brochures about her saying this person is a terrorist. Just because, again, this girl spoke up for Palestine at a big rally in Indianapolis, and brochures were sent out about her, like slandering her, saying all kinds of terrible things. So it's just things that it didn't make the news. It's never going to make the news, but it happens across college campuses everywhere.
I have seen it where it has silence. I've seen it among young academics. Young Arab academics now, when they come to America, even Palestinians, I've seen them keeping quiet. And that has really upset me, and it's a matter of concern. They internalize suppression of their own speech.
If you start conceding to one side or another just for the sake of not looking like an angry Muslim or an angry Arab, then you start supporting, certain perspectives and certain narratives and not getting what you view as the truth across.
Many people who went into the universities in the US were told in graduate school, do not touch Palestine. People have told me this. They were told by their advisors, if you want to get a job, if you want to get a grant, do not write anything critically about Palestine and Israel.
In 1982, just before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, together with a Palestinian from Kafiot, we proposed the first ever class on Palestine in the whole University of California system. And I still have a vivid memory that the historian expert on Middle Eastern studies, who was a big-time Zionist, and the complete expert, who was also a big-time Zionist, went with me and that student.
So here we are, two graduate students and these two very powerful professors. And we're negotiating having a summer class for 1 unit on Palestine. So the historian said, well, I don't see why we need to teach about Palestine because it ceased to exist in 1948. I don't know where I got the courage to tell him, but well, professor, you're an Ottomanist, and the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist way before Palestine, and your courses are in the course catalog.
And the Israeli lobby is not entirely, this is something also has to be dispelled in our part of the world. It is not a Jewish lobby. It is an American lobby. It is a Christian lobby. I mean, I would say evangelical Christians are now the backbone of the pro-Israel lobby in this country.
We do not support Israel for any end-time scenario. We support Israel for Bible reasons that have been there for 2,000 years.
They have a theology about why the Jews should return to Palestine, and that has to do with what they understand as the timetable for the second coming of Jesus Christ.
We are in a world that is fast changing. The whole idea of humanity is a very big, tough question on everybody. People's future are always at risk and been wondering. And people always need the idea of religion. They need the idea of belief in God that safeguard them, that guide them into tough times, that clarifies their future. And unfortunately, greedy fascist right-wing people in the world have always used people need in belief of religion. They used people need in creating stories that cover their actual reasons of greed, of economic, of hegemony, of power control, not of anything related to religion.
Ronald Reagan very consciously tried to mobilize evangelical Protestants for the Republican Party, even though he was not particularly religious himself. Neither is Trump, that doesn't matter. And he was very successful.
There is sin and evil in the world, and we're enjoined by Scripture and the Lord Jesus to oppose it with all our might. Our nation, too, has a legacy of evil with which it must deal.
A person's faith is disgraceful. I'm proud to be a Christian, and as president, I will not allow Christianity to be consistently attacked and weakened, unlike what is happening now with our current president.
I mean, Donald Trump has been doing services to Israel and its occupation, not in order to please the Jewish community, which is 70% supporting of Democrat, but in order to please his base, the evangelical Christians.
Ultimately, politicians have to be reelected. And it's actually the Christian evangelical supporters of Israel who supply much more of those actual votes than, for example, Jewish supporters of Israel.
For the current within the evangelical Protestant community, which are called premillennial dispensationalists, it's fine if there's total chaos in Israel-Palestine, because that's a sign that the Messiah is coming again soon.
And if you'll read Zechariah 14:12, the Bible says, "And this is the plague that God shall send on all the armies that come to fight against Jerusalem, that the skin shall melt from their bodies before their corpse can hit the ground, and their tongue shall melt in their sockets as will their eyes." That is the perfect description.
So that they are simply not concerned with anybody's human rights violations or any of that stuff. It's fine if there's wars. It's fine if Israel attacks Gaza. If you go back and check the website and the public statements of Christians United for Israel at the time of Israel's major assaults on the Gaza Strip in 2008-9, in 2012, and in 2014.
The Jewish people are home. They are exactly where God Almighty said they should be and should remain forever.
They had not the slightest hesitation about supporting it 100%, despite the number of civilians that were killed, attacks on schools, on hospitals, on UN facilities. None of that mattered at all to them. Neither did it matter to AIPAC, which doesn't have a Christian religious reason for supporting Israel. They just support Israel.
What the pro-Israel lobby has been doing is that if you're critical of Israel, or if you are anti-Zionist, as I am, vehemently anti-Zionist, they make you as if you're anti-Semitic, which is totally not true. You can be pro-Israel and be anti-Semitic. You can be anti-Israel and not be anti-Semitic.
Then God sent a hunter. A hunter is someone who comes with a gun and he forces you. Hitler was a hunter. And the Bible says, Jeremiah writing, they shall hunt them from every mountain and from every hill out of the holes of the rocks, meaning there's no place to hide. And that will be offensive to some people. Well, dear heart, be offended. I didn't write it. Jeremiah wrote it.
Way back in the 1970s, when Menachem Begin was Prime Minister of Israel, he gave Jerry Falwell the Jabotinsky Award. Jabotinsky is the historic ideological leader of the political current that became the Likud. Now, Jerry Falwell's theology, like the theology of John Hagee and Christians United for Israel today, is anti-Semitic.
But the Israeli lobby plays games with these terms. They refuse to accept that many supporters of Israel and Netanyahu are anti-Semites. But Israel doesn't mind. As long as you support Israel, you can be vehemently anti-Semitic.
Yeah. Judaism. You know, you can't be saved being a Jew. You know who said that, by the way? The three greatest Jews in the New Testament, Peter, Paul, and Jesus Christ. They all said Judaism won't do it. It's faith in Jesus Christ.
Now, we want to thank you, especially today, for the courageous leadership of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his determination to do whatever it takes to protect his people at all costs.
But that's not what Begin was concerned about at all, because he's from his point of view, we don't believe that, what the Christian Zionists believe, so it doesn't really matter if they think that this is going to happen and Jews will die when the second coming happens and so on. And B, Jews are cleverer than Christians anyway, so if there's a problem, we'll work it out. This is also very deep in Israeli political culture, that we are smarter than everybody else.
I would say the Israeli lobby is not a violation of American democracy. It is part of America's vision of the Middle East, where war is a tool of America's design to impose its will, to keep government that are oppressive on the side of the United States, to change government. It fits with America's imperialist plans for the region.
If your starting assumption is that the United States is the police force for the world, and that the 800 to 1,000 military bases that we maintain abroad, we need those, and we should have those, and we're the nation that needs to kind of provide security for everybody. Israel has played a role in supporting us through intelligence sharing and more than intelligence sharing. It's the torture techniques that were used in Abu Ghraib were derived from books written by Israeli anthropologists about the Arab mind. If your mindset is that the United States should play this role in the international arena, then you can see a fair amount of benefit from that relationship. Now, if your view is different, then of course the calculus is completely different.
3 million Iraqis were killed by American war machine for the benefits of Israel and for the benefit of the control of oil. Look at the two national security interests of America. Thousands and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians has been killed for the last 70 years with American weaponry given to Israel. Thousands of Yemeni today is being killed by Saudis using American weaponry. Thousands of Muslims in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Tunisia, in Libya has all been killed with American weaponry. When we will stop? When will that stop? When will that change?
The United States is an empire. William Appleton Williams, a very well-known American historian, wrote a book called Empire as a Way of Life. And he has a very broad view of what that means, going all the way back to dispossessing the Native Americans. I mean, that was a form of imperial conquest. seizing half of Mexico and annexing it to the United States. The Spanish-American War in 1898, the Philippines was a direct colony of the United States until 1946. Puerto Rico is still effectively a colony. Hawaii annexed to the United States. These are all imperial acts. There was a period of occupation of Haiti, occupation of Nicaragua, the whole Monroe Doctrine idea. So the United States has always been an empire, and it has always denied that it's an empire.
I mean, in reality, America is a big boy, and America knows its way around the Middle East and around the world. And it finds Israel to be convenient to it, and it uses it, and allows itself to be used by Israel. So it's a beneficial arrangement for them from the standpoint of spreading America's imperial designs. Having said that, I think we can say that on the long term, there's tremendous damage that has been accumulated to America as a country and to the people of this country by virtue of this horrendous hostility and endorsement wholesale of wars and occupation by the State of Israel against Arabs throughout. This is something the American people know very little about.
I will cite for you just one fact. Osama bin Laden, just before the 2004 election, the second, when George Bush was reelected in this country, just before that election, he issued a video. And in it, he said, the very first time I envisioned towers tumbling in New York City was as I was watching the Israeli bombardment of downtown Beirut in 1982 on television. So, in other words, a substantial reason for the hostility toward the United States has been our support of Israel.
Well, the thing is, I don't like to use the word terrorism and terrorist groups and so on, because this terminology is extremely polluted by Israel and by the United States. And they have their own ways of defining who is terrorist and who's not, which I totally reject. I mean, I think that for anybody who cares about the menace of terrorism, we should go back to the roots. All the roots of terrorism started with the Zionist movement in the Middle East. They were the one who introduced all the weapons of terrorism. You name them. Bombs in markets, bombs on buses, letter bombs, bombs in ambulances, shooting at people at random in a crowded street. All those were done by the Zionist groups in the 1930s. So when we speak about terrorist groups, whose definition are we using?
Can this legal system do things that would support justice? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. And I will tell you that right now, the legal, and I say this because I have seen how the legal system has been turned in such a way as to further injustice. Now, a condition for that is the political will to change the laws and to make the laws promote justice as opposed to repression. And do I see that happening in the United States anytime soon? Sorry, I don't.
Well, I mean, in general, where does morality play a role in U.S. foreign policy? In what area of the world? I mean, I'm a student of international relations, I teach the subject, and I am hard-pressed to find a moment where American foreign policy was dictated by morality. It doesn't work like that. Not in this country. Maybe in Sweden sometimes in Sweden, but in America, I cannot think of a situation. Morality doesn't play a role. I mean, if morality plays a role, America would not have recognized the State of Israel in 1948, would not have supported every single Israeli invasion, attack, assault, and war crime massacre since 1948. Morality has no room. It's just like, we will sound stupid if we even discuss it, I think.
So it's not like everybody is terrible in the United States, but there has always been this struggle between those two currents of opinion, a kind of nativist, know-nothing, pro-imperial, anti-foreign current, which is not accidentally also allied with misogyny and prejudice against gays and lesbians and transgender people, and even anti-Semitism. I mean, white nationalism is first and foremost anti-Semitic, historically. So there's always been that. And there has always been the other current of opinion as well, which only rarely has had the upper hand.